Quiet down. Quiet down, everybody. Please, quiet down. Thank you. My name is Victorian Blues. Some people just call me Victorian. And I love Arknights. Yes, I'm glad to hear many of you do as well. We are here today because soon the most anticipated game of the century will be released. That's right, of course. I'm talking about Arknights Endfield. But some of you might not have played Arknights before. Perhaps it was just not your type of game. That's okay. Or perhaps you never paid much attention to the story, even when you did play it. And that is actually shameful. But in either case, you might be wondering, what do I need to know before I play Endfield? That is why I am here today, to present a summary of all that you will want to know about the setting and the lore of Arknights. Because of course Endfield does not exist in a vacuum. So, without further ado, let's begin. For those who have been here before, I will be turning off my camera. And the on-screen chat, for the sake of immersion. Ba-bam. I said, of course, technical difficulty. Why did it minimize itself? There we go. Ba-bam. Welcome to my custom PRTS system. Before we begin in earnest, spoiler warning. Of course, I have tried to keep spoilers relevant and to a minimum. But there are still some major spoilers that we will be talking about in regards to Arknights, because that directly ties in to Endfield. This is your last chance. There is no going back after this. Your eyes will be opened. Are we good? Good. So, of course, you may or may not know that Endfield takes place on a world called Talos 2. But Arknights takes place on a world called Terra. And thus, the inhabitants of Talos, the 2 is important, come from, or at least their ancestors come from Terra. And so, this will help shape their culture and their history. And that's why it's important to know where they came from. So let's start with an overview of the world inside the database. Starting with, of course, the geography of Terra. Terra is a world not too dissimilar from Earth. However, it, as far as we know, has a single Pangea-like landmass where all of the human population lives. There may or may not be other landmasses. We do not know for certain. While you can see some lush environments like the Victorian marshes or the tropical jungles around Mount Siesta, most of the continent is covered in wastelands like the Rimbilitan outback. And these wastelands act as natural buffers between the various nations, and also means that those nations have to contend with each other over habitable land. To make matters even more complicated, the world is ravaged by catastrophes, natural disasters spawned by Originium. Keep that word in mind, it's important, but we'll get to that later. Another important thing about the quote-unquote geography of the world, although I don't know if you technically count it as geography, but it is part of the environment and nature of the world, and that is that Terra is surrounded by what is called the Star Pod, which is located around 6,000 meters above the ground and hinders anything attempting to leave or enter the atmosphere, or even high altitude aircraft. It also naturally obscures the night sky, which made astronomy practically useless for most of Terran history. And that brings us to the nations of the world, and a nice, lovely map showing their locations, their names, and the continent's shape itself. The nations of Terra and the cultures are analogous to our own in some ways, likely as an influence from Originium, and there are 20 or 19, I guess, depending on who you ask, countries on modern-day Terra. You have places like Victoria in the center, which is a superpower and a constitutional monarchy. They were masters of steam technology in the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. One thing you will notice is that politically, most of Terra is still in the stage of monarchies and despots. There are few democracies, and in fact, really only the nation of Colombia is pretty much the only democratic republic on the planet. And though they espouse equality, they often fall short on that, and on being democratic. But most nations are ruled by some sort of aristocracy. There are a couple, like Rembiliton, which are a corporate mining state run by several large families. Kajimersh, which is also a pseudo-corporate state in which knights have become celebrities, pushed by the General Chamber of Commerce, a collection of mega corporations. And there are some nations that are theocracies instead. Yerig is a theocracy centered in a valley around the tallest mountain on Terra, Mount Carlon, which is just below the star pod. They've recently begun rapid industrialization after ending their isolationism. And Laterano is a theocracy and ethno-state founded by the Sankta and ruled by the Sankta, famous for their guns and desserts. Outside of the nations, there are tribes and bandit gangs that roam the wastelands. The Rusthammers being a large and well-known one. And as I said, the cultures have some similarities to Earth cultures, and so do the languages, as a matter of fact. Though they are named different things, we know, thanks to Tachanka from Rainbow Six, there was a crossover, that he speaks Russian, but he could understand some Ursi, the language spoken in the Empire of Ursus, an oppressive, hyper-imperialist nation. Now you might see this map and the borders hexagonal on this case, but you also see that there's sort of disconnections between the land. Not everything is filled in. And that has to do with the environment, but also how the nations of this world actually exist. And that's because of the nomadic cities. Due to the geography and the occurrence of catastrophes, which are devastating and dangerous natural disasters, a large portion of the human population live on nomadic cities, depicted here. Basically, if you want a population larger than a small town, it has to be nomadic. There are some exceptions, of course. And nomadic cities are massive mobile platforms, often made of multiple plates. As you can see, each of these like squares are plates of various sizes. They can come together, connect and disconnect. While I was never able to ever find population numbers of how big these sorts of cities might be, we do have a comparison size. One of my favorite little pieces of lore for these things is that the nomadic city Shengshu, a city of Yen, is so large it literally has mountains built on top of it. They moved mountains and put them onto the city plates. So these things are massive. The largest nations of Terra will have dozens of nomadic cities, moving around on set courses and avoiding catastrophes whenever possible. And that's why the borders might seem a little bit more fluid in a sense. Small nations, though, are city-states made up of single nomadic cities. Now on Talos, which presumably does not have catastrophes, I imagine that nomadic cities are a thing of the past, and from what I have seen, that probably is the case based on gameplay and everything else. It'll be interesting to see, I think, how people talk about nomadic cities, how that might have influenced society in any way. And now we'll move on to something related both to nomadic cities and world nations. The protagonists of Arknights, we'll give them a brief shout out. Rhodes Island, which is a paramilitary pharmaceutical non-profit organization, and I do think they are indeed non-profit. I guess there's some contention there, but they don't make money. They're always in the red. They're always bleeding money, but that's okay because money is not their goal. They are based out of a land ship of the same name. Now, land ships are vessels, platforms used for habitation, for work, or even for military purposes. Again, numbers aren't given exactly, but we have been told that Rhodes Island can hold 2,000 people. So again, these things are, well, they live up to the name land ship. Seafaring is not very common on Terra. So, I guess in a way, replacing boats, we have the land ships, which function very similarly. In fact, the military has battleships, but these battleships are land-based. And Rhode Island has 3 leaders: Amia, Dr. Countsit, and the Doctor, the protagonist, or the player character rather, not the protagonist, really. And their goal is to cure Oripathy. And really to unite the nations of Terra and save the world. But they're kind of going to start with Oripathy. And that brings us to Originium. What is Originium? Originium is very important to the world of Arknights, and to the story, and to the lore in many ways. Originium is a crystalline mineral found across terrestrial Terra. It's not found in the oceans. And it is the primary energy source for Terran civilization. It is burned for fuel. It is used and crafted into electronics and circuitry, and it is made into weapons. Gunpowder does not exist. You use Originium for explosives and gunpowder replacements. The problem, however, is that Originium is extremely toxic. And in large quantities causes catastrophes. So civilization is built upon it. It cannot exist without it. But it also makes people deathly sick with Oripathy. Oripathy is an incurable disease caused by Originium assimilating inside the body. All people have trace amounts of Originium inside of them, inside their blood. Just the nature of society as it exists due to the widespread usage of Originium in an industry. But as long as the Originium does not begin assimilating with your cells, you are uninfected. You will not have Oripathy. People with Oripathy are known as the infected. After some research, it seems that as long as you don't reach around 0.18 units per liter in blood crystal density, you are safe. Most infected have around 0.2 to 0.3 liters or units per liter, based on in-game characters. So what does Oripathy do to you? Well, like I said, it's Originium assimilating your cells. Oripathy turns the infected's body into Originium. Slowly but surely. As the disease progresses, more and more crystals will grow in and on the body. And as they do, this of course causes various other ailments and symptoms, especially depending on where the crystals are growing on you. Lesions, internally, externally, nervous system problems, brain, neural problems, if it's growing there. Perhaps blindness if it grows in your eye, things like that. There's at least one report, symptom-wise, of Originium causing mutations as it assimilates with your cells. There is a character, Province, her tail is larger than normal. And apparently, that has to do with Originium. But eventually, all infected will succumb to Oripathy, and upon death, the infected disintegrates, as depicted here. The disintegration is even explosive, so as to spread Originium particles into the air and to serve as a new vector of further infection. It should be noted that before this death, infected are not contagious, contrary to popular belief. You cannot get one from being in the presence or touching an infected. Infection usually occurs through breathing in high concentrations of Originium particles in the air or being cut by a piece of Originium. But for all its bad, it does have its uses, not just in industry, but also in Originium Arts. Originium Arts is the magic produced by Originium's ability to manipulate matter. And this can be displayed in a wide variety of forms, from elemental arts like fire and lightning arts, as depicted here, to conjuration-like arts that can serve to create Originium constructs like the art Colossus depicted here. There's emotional-based arts, there's biological arts like controlling plants, there's physics-based ones like gravity manipulation. There's healing arts, though they have limited uses, as to utilize healing arts you have to actually understand biology. So you have to be a doctor pretty much. And if you're a doctor, well, using traditional science and medicine works fine. So healing arts, they don't have a lot of uses, but they do appear. People seem to have natural affinities towards certain types of arts. However, I could not actually find anything that specifically says that to be the case. It does seem to be the case. And there's nothing that says you can't learn other types of arts that are not your natural affinity. But that might be perhaps more difficult. Again, not really talked about. But we do know that it is possible because the world's strongest caster, person who utilizes Originium Arts, known as a caster, the Witch King of Lytania, well, he knew everything about Originium Arts and could do anything with it. Now, to utilize Originium Arts, there's two ways you can go about this. One is to utilize an arts unit, often called wands or staves. And the other way is to go through what you could call blood casting. Now, arts units are safe. They utilize an external piece of Originium to channel the art. anyone can learn to use one. Blood casting, as it were, however, is only available to infected people. And it is very dangerous because it will hasten one's Originium assimilation, therefore quickening one's death. But it is possible to utilize the Originium in your blood to cast arts instead of using an arts unit. Now, arts units come in many different forms. Traditional wands and staves, to musical instruments, which is popular among the Lytonians, who are known for their music culture and for their study of Originium Arts in general. To swords and other melee weapons can have units embedded into them. Altars are often used in Sarkaz witchcraft, which we'll come back to that. And one other type of arts unit, which is the firearm, the gun. Guns on Terra are special weapons that utilize Originium arts instead of gunpowder, because gunpowder does not exist. So arts requires, or guns rather, require special training for casters to use them, and so they're rare. Partly for that, and partly because they are what's the word? Controlled, for lack of a better word, by the Sankta, who are regarded as the inventors of the firearm and make the most prolific use of them. They don't like giving them out freely to other people. However, that being said, that's largely limited to handguns. Cannons and artillery do exist and seem to be widespread among the world's militaries. So that does seem to be a bit of like a sort of medieval era tech where everyone could get cannons eventually, but handguns were still a bit more rare. But as you can see from this image of Patron Firearms, the guns themselves are not antiquated types. We have modern assault rifles alongside, in this case, some lever action rifles. Now in Endfield, from what I've seen, Endfield gamified Originium Arts in the sense that there's only seems to be 4 types that characters will have. I believe it was like fire, lightning, ice, and nature. But of course, there's a lot more than just that. Arknights itself technically made arts a generic thing. There was no specific type. If you were an arts-based character, you utilized arts, and that individual character, the display of that arts could be whatever that character used, so that be lightning, gravity, whatever. Later on, they did add some elemental damage, which represented some specific types of arts. But there was always the generic fallback. So Endfield doesn't have that, which I wonder if that will lead to limitations in character lore. if the characters were always going to get are only ever going to be utilizing those specific elements. And I also think that could trick players into believing that there is only 4 types of arts, but there is not. So don't be fooled. Of course, they could always add more in the future, I suppose. Although you do have the issue then of like, well, you don't want to bloat the mechanics. I don't blame them for limiting it in that regard. Time will tell. And that is the world itself. An intro to Terra, the geography, the geopolitics. But, of course, there are people who live on that planet. So let's look into now the humans and other species of Terra. Starting with what we'll call the Terrans. As you can immediately see, the Terrans, while looking human, have traits associated with various animals. And these are just some of the races that are found on the planet. This is by no means all of them, just an arbitrary list. And I chose characters that I felt represented a good sort of baseline appearance. So why do these humans, these Terrans, have animal traits? Well, that's because they were animals once. They're not actually humans. They were created by information inside Originium that humanized animals as it was later discussed. Specifically animals that were from originally Talos 2. No cats? Just wait. There are cats. And that's interesting, because that implies that these normal animals are brought over from Talos 2, but that they also existed on Talos 2, which they presumably were brought there as well. And it should be noted that there are no normal Earth animals on Terra. The Terran fauna are unique creatures. Although, I don't know if they're native or not themselves. Some of them probably are. So Originium uplifted these animals and made them take on human form. That created the Terrans. And the Terrans are divided into races based on these animal traits. The races aren't limited to a single species or even genus. There are some races that are comprised of several separate families grouped together. In fact, the Aegir are probably the most notorious of all because they just include all sea creatures: mammalian, mollusk, fish, pretty much anything that swims. And besides being divided into the separate races, they're also divided into two groups: the Ancients and the Elders. The Ancients, depicted here with the green rhombus, are based on real animals. The Coranta are horses, the Pero are dogs, Archosauria are crocodiles, Aegir, like I said, are just any sort of sea creature, Capernae are goats and other similar animals, Liberi are all birds. Then there are the Elders, which are races based on mythological creatures. The implication of that in terms of, well, if Terrans were humanized, were there mythological creatures walking around? I don't know. Draco are dragons. Kilin are Killins, or Kirins, something like that. Ka'ukalans are these winged serpents. Lung are eastern dragons, for example. Now there's two here, Voivra and Manticore, that are a bit unusual, because most Elder, or all Elders, are based on mythological creatures. Most Ancients are based on real animals, but there are a few exceptions. For whatever reason, the Voivra, which are wyverns, are considered Ancients. And as far as I can tell, so are Manticores as well. Now, these traits also don't just apply to the phenotypes, but also to their abilities. Coranta are excellent runners, for instance. Voivra are very tough and apparently can survive without food for long periods of time. Draco have extra powerful fire arts. Ka'ukalkans have powerful wind arts and could even fly, apparently. And the split between Ancient and Elders is that, well, Elders were themselves considered stronger than Ancients, both in arts and even physical capabilities. And in fact, Terran humans are stronger than Earth humans in general. And we have many examples of this. Blaze, a feline character, could easily survive jumping off an 18-story hotel in the event Such is the Joy of Our Reunion, and also she is known to jump out of helicopters. The Terrans also can easily survive gunshots, especially human guns. Quote, "Even though we were shooting to incapacitate rather than kill, these guys were still unusually tough. That one there survived a full shotgun blast at point blank range." And that's from the event Originium Dust. Or actually, was it Lunescent Arrowhead? One of those two. I think it was Lunescent Arrowhead. So that's the Terrans, which makes up the majority of the human population of Terra. But they are not the only humans walking around. Actually, before I do that, I almost forgot. Apologies. One more thing I wanted to discuss. Mentioning those felines, the cats. Further animal traits. Some individuals are known to be fully anthropomorphic. Usually, for some reason, men. And in fact, all Archosauria men that we've seen have been anthropomorphic. There are at least some cases of anthropomorphic women, but it's rare. I don't know if that's actually a thing in the lore, or perhaps it's just a marketing thing. I'm inclined to believe it might be that. Anthropomorphism, or bestial Terrans, as I believe they're actually called, can just show up in people. Like I said, Archosaurian men seem to have it extremely common, but it can just show up, and it doesn't stay within families. Depicted here are two father-daughter pairs. The top one, Huai Tianpei, and his daughter Wai Fu, are both bestial, while the bottom pair, the Rat King and his daughter Lin, well, Lin is not bestial. So it just comes and goes within individuals. It's a pretty rare phenotype in general, though. But it does happen. We've had we only ever get one parent. That is true. We've only ever seen one. We don't know what the mothers are like in this case. Now on to the next group of humans. The T-Kaz. Specifically starting off with the Sarkaz. Unlike the Terrans, which were animals not native to Terra, the T-Kaz are the native alien species of the planet, and they were truly alien before being humanized by Originium. The humanized T-Kaz became, most of them at least, became the Sarkaz, the inheritors of the T-Kaz, the ones that are considered the direct descendants of them. And while the Terrans are based after animals, the T-Kaz, as you can tell by the names, at the very least, are based on and named after mythological beings, often sort of evil in nature, but not always. And they are split into 12 bloodlines, as opposed to races. We have the vampires, banshees, liches, gargoyle, cyclops, Natzera, Jal, the Goliaths, the Wendigos, the Damatzi. There is one more called the Diablo, but they are extinct, and so they're not depicted here. Appearance-wise, the Sarkaz typically have horns and pointed ears, sometimes tails. Vampires stand out for always being hornless and tailless. And though depicted here are the 12 bloodlines, the pure-blood Sarkaz, most Sarkaz are not pure-blooded. Most Sarkaz are mixed-blooded. They do not fall under these 12 bloodlines. And this split between pure and mixed blood Sarkaz is kind of similar to the split between elders and ancient Terrans, with the pure-blooded being generally stronger. Vampires have powerful blood arts, liches have powerful dimensional arts, and even invented phylacteries that they could store their souls outside of reality and remain immortal. Banshees, interestingly, are commonly female, almost always, and they have powerful language-based arts, which utilize their written language to invoke power. Many Sarkaz reside within their homeland of Kazdal, a nation that has moved and been destroyed countless times over the many millennia of history. It is not a prosperous nation, but it is really the only nation the Sarkaz have. Others live scattered across the world, facing discrimination by the Terrans, who believe the Sarkaz are savages, warmongers, and also bringers of Oripathy. And that is because the Sarkaz are extremely vulnerable to Originium. Their race has an intrinsic tie to the mineral, and because of that vulnerability, most of them are infected. And so there is a common association between them and infection. This tie to Originium allows them to perform ritualistic arts, draining their very life force, or the life force of other Sarkaz, referred to as witchcraft, often using those altars I mentioned earlier. But they also had a deeper connection to Originium than just that. The Sarkaz race had a collective consciousness known as the Myriad Souls. The souls of the dead stored within Originium that helped perpetuate the Sarkaz's warlike tendencies and their thirst for vengeance against the Terrans. However, in the events of Arknights, the Myriad Souls would be destroyed, and setting the Sarkaz free to hopefully move on from their race's traumatic past. Which means that Sarkaz that appear within Endfield will hopefully have moved on as well. Forgot to show a picture of the Myriad Souls. There we go. And also the Black Crown. The Black Crown is a cultural artifact of the Sarkaz, the symbol of their king, the King of Sarkaz, the Lord of Fiends. Whoever wears the Black Crown becomes the King of Sarkaz. Anyone could become one. They just have to wear the crown. Crown allowed for communication and connection with the Myriad Souls and Originium itself, and also stored the memories of previous wearers, allowing for the sharing of history and knowledge between the kings. We'll come back to that a little bit later. There is also one more group of Sarkaz that we'll discuss later as well. But there are some other Tikaz descendants we'll talk about now. Four of them, to be precise. Starting with the Sankta. The Sankta have origins to the Tikaz, but they were a group of Tikaz uplifted by their god called the Law. The Law turned these Tikaz into angels, gifting them halos and wings of light, the signature trait of the Sankta. And these halos also gave the Sankta a unique ability called Empathy, with a capital E. Empathy gave the Sankta the ability to perfectly sense each other's emotions. Not quite a gestalt or hive mind, as the Sankta are very much still individuals, but empathy does help influence each other's emotions as a whole, which allowed them to create a harmonious society, Laterano, as I mentioned before. It also is probably why Sankta have such a notorious sweet tooth. Sankta like to congregate together and reside largely in Laterano, although there are Sankta elsewhere in the world. However, Sankta who have been away from each other for extended periods of time are known to have trouble reintegrating into the empathy. Another trait of the Sankta is their ability to become fallen. Fallen Sankta are those who have broken the law, capital L, law. When the law created the Sankta, it gave them a set of rules. And if you break those rules, the Sankta will revert to a more Sarkaz-like state, growing horns and tails, and their halos will shatter. The most common way to become a Fallen is for a Sankta to shoot another Sankta with their patron firearm. Every Sankta is given a firearm at a coming-of-age ceremony. That is called their patron firearm. And although that's the most common way, it's still a bit arbitrary, and the other rules are not explicitly known. So the process is a bit arbitrary as a whole, as there have been instances of Sankta breaking the law, but not falling. And so, despite their origins as coming from the Tikaz, and despite them even being able to kind of become like Sarkaz, the Sankta hate the Sarkaz. In general. This is a generalization. Sankta society views the Sarkaz to be evil. And in fact, Sarkaz are not allowed in Laterano at all. Neither are infected, for that matter. Different countries treat the infected in different ways. Some better than others. All of them pretty discriminatory. The Sankta exile them. Now, an important thing to note is that in the year 1101, Sankta society irreversibly changed. After an event that saw the law attempt to convert all life and matter on the planet into angels, empathy was greatly diminished when that crisis was resolved. And so now empathy only affect Sankta whom are friends and family with each other. They aren't really able to read strangers' emotions as well anymore. And that's important because, again, in Endfield, presumably, unless something is strange, that will be how Sankta are interacting with each other, as opposed to as we know them here on Terra. Now, the other three races descendant from the Tkaz are the Anasa, whom are a rare race descendant from Sarkaz or Tkaz who traveled to eastern Terra under the Sarkaz king Quilon 1,000 years ago. You might see from this character here that she seems to have a halo, and that's because this Anasa do have halos, but they're not like the Sankta halos. They do not have empathy, and they were not given to them by the law. The Anasas seem to have achieved halos through enlightenment via Buddhism. What that means and how that works, we don't know, but that seems to be the case. Then we have the Oni, which, like the Anasa, are descendant from Sarkaz who followed Quilon eastward. The Oni differ from normal Sarkaz in that they lack tails and will sometimes only have one horn. And then there are the Durin, a race of dwarves that live in underground city-states spread across Terra. They're descended from Sarkaz that ventured underground in search of ancient relics, which those ancient relics might be why the Durin have some more advanced technology compared to surface races. Besides their short stature, they also lack horns and tails, but they do have the pointed ears. Probably the biggest disconnect from the Sarkaz for the Anasa, Durin, and Oni, and of course the Sankta as well, is that they had no connection to the myriad souls, and are not really considered related to Sarkaz at all among Terran society and culture. And it does not seem that they have the same Originium vulnerability, and they certainly do not face the same discrimination. How they became this disconnected is not said, but somehow they did escape it. And that is all of the Tkaz. So now we're moving on to a selection of other races. Starting with the Fernamuts. Fernamuts are not god, but they are aliens with god-like abilities, often considered gods by Terran societies, especially in the past, not so much nowadays. They can live for thousands of years, if not just being immortal entirely. They have powers that include things like manipulating time, dreams. They can transform the very land and nature itself. They can create other dimensions even. A commonly shared ability among Fernamuts seems to be their powers of creation, where not just dimensions, but even other living beings. And they can take human form. Not because they were humanized like the Terrans or the Ticas, but just because they have the ability to do that if they so want. This is called the avatar form. So here we have the character Shu, a Fernamuts, with her Fernamuts form, which in this case looks like a dragon, as the Soy Fernamuts often appear as, and then her avatar form. But the Fernamuts come in many different forms, usually some sort of giant monster. They can appear as flying whales, as dragons. A Fernamuts called the Kerula Arbor looks like a tree thing. Down here we have a Fernamuts that looks like some sort of bovine creature. We also know that Fernamuts are able to shatter their bodies and consciousness into multiple fragments, forcibly or otherwise. And they also are able to give up their powers and become truly human, as shown by the Fernamuts Chongyu. Now, Fernamuts are potentially native to Terra. Signs seem to point to that being the case. However, it was mentioned in the event Path of Life that there was at least one Fernamuts on Talos. Specifically, though, Talos, not Talos 2. Which is a whole interesting scenario in and of itself. Talos, of course, Talos 2 is the moon of Talos. Talos being a gas giant. So what they were doing on a gas giant, I don't know. Now, as I mentioned, the Fernamuts can create other living beings, and in fact one Fernamuts did create an entire race of living beings, the Elves. A human race created by the Fernamuts Mule. Originally it was thought that the Fernamuts Sami created the elves, but according to our sole elf character right here, Mulesies, it's actually the Fernamuts Mule who is currently missing. Elves are extremely rare. In part because they are extremely vulnerable to Originium, more so than even Sarkaz. And because of this, elves have to live away from human civilization. And reside in nature, living in trees. Not only are they extremely vulnerable, but elves do not have access to arts at all. Although they do still seem to have some sort of magical ability, as Mulesies can control water. This maybe stems from their origins as being creations of Fernamuts? Unknown. And I should also mention, I forgot to, is that Fernamuts are immune to Originium, actually. They cannot be affected by it. Which is why they were never humanized. And elves look like typical elves. They've got pointed ears and youthful appearances. Now we return to the last Sarkaz related group. And I saved them here because they're a bit different from the other ones. The Revenants. Revenants are not a race, bloodline, or tribe of Sarkaz, but rather a group of individual Sarkaz whom were killed and then turned into ghosts by Originium. And so Revenants have the typical ghostly abilities: incorporeal bodies, immortality. They can possess object, influence people's minds. And that ability to possess objects has allowed this Revenant, Tin Man, to possess a robot body that he utilizes to live in everyday society. Now, the Revenants, for many centuries, were self-imprisoned inside the Soul Furnace, a massive furnace that powers the Sarkaz homeland of Kazdal. They used themselves as the fuel source because they couldn't die. Some of the Revenants were not in this furnace. Tin Man never went inside. Apparently there are others that are implied to have existed as never having been in the furnace. After the events of a Kazdalian rescue and Sarkaz's furnace-side fables, however, the Revenants were freed from the Soul Furnace. So we might just see some of them on Talos. Who knows? And last but not least of the Terran species, something similar to the Revenants, the Beast Lords. Whereas the Revenants were Sarkaz turned into ghosts upon death, the Beast Lords were animals that were turned into ghosts upon death. Specifically the same animals that would eventually be humanized into the Ancients. The Beast Lords were created a significant amount of time before the surviving animals were humanized. And they, of course, have the typical ghostly abilities, incorporeal bodies, immortality. They also have the ability to fuse together into a singular being, as is the case of Dolly up here. Dolly is a sheep beast lord, but is actually comprised of a bunch of sheep beast lord that fuse together. They can also create minions called beast stewards or beast kin. Beast lords often have these minions serve or watch over favored humans that they just like. In terms of Endfield, we can talk about the character Ea Fiala, or as you might know her in Endfield, Ardelia. She's watched over by the little black sheep, which are stewards created by Dolly. They also seem to have other abilities. At least one Beast Lord, Gawain, a lion, seemed to have precognitive abilities, being able to tell the future. And another Beast Lord, Amma, was said to have divine powers, potentially given to them by the Fernamuts. Because of their appearances, Beast Lords are often mistaken for bestial ancients, anthropomorphic ancients, or simply just really weird animals. They all live very different lives, are very eccentric, Emperor here is a world-famous rapper. The Signori dei Lupi up here are a bunch of wolf beast lords who are playing a never-ending battle royale amongst themselves. Dolly kind of just likes goofing off and surfing lava and volcanoes. So they're all a bit eccentric. And now we turn to the last quote-unquote race we'll be discussing. The Predecessors. The Predecessors are the true Homo sapiens from Earth that were almost destroyed, almost entirely destroyed, over 10,000 years ago. These are the ones who would have brought the animals from Talos to Terra, and probably brought the animals from Earth to Talos? Unless we're going to find out Talos is somehow Earth around a gas giant, but I would find that highly unlikely. The thought has crossed my mind, though. The Predecessors were hyper-advanced transhumans. For those familiar with science fiction and the Kardashev scale, they were probably a type 3 civilization, or maybe even higher, I think. They had many miraculous and advanced technologies. Pretty much anything you could think of. Megastructure engineering, advanced genetic and biology manipulation. One of my favorites that is mentioned is their ability to project their consciousness across the universe without having to actually physically move. So, although they had space travel, they didn't need to actually travel anywhere. They also invented the sarcophagus. The sarcophagi are special pods that could heal any injury and keep people in stasis for extremely long time, potentially indefinitely. We actually we don't know the exact number, but potentially indefinitely, certainly for thousands upon thousands upon thousands upon thousands of years. Towards the end of the Predecessors, civilization, or society rather, might have not even existed anymore. It's kind of implied that there were not many humans left by that point, and that humans had become more solitary species that were spread far apart across the universe. But some of them did come together towards the end, because the survivors of the Predecessors went to Terra and Talos too, to find a way to preserve their civilization from an unstoppable existential threat. Terra became a testbed for these technologies, which accumulated in the creation of Originium. That's right, Originium is not a native mineral, but a creation of the Predecessors. A sort of special information storage device that would contain all the knowledge of their civilization which is why it humanized animals. And probably why culture and society on Terra evolved in ways that we are kind of familiar with. They also invented the Black Crown, which was a device used to communicate with Originium, and as I mentioned, could communicate with the wearers, with past wearers, the knowledge that they had. And even the law that uplifted the Sankta was ultimately a creation by them. Due to their nature, as the creators of Originium, it should be mentioned that they too are immune to Originium's effects. They also invented a biomechanical life form. Which would take the identity of Dr. Calcit. And I mention this really only because, well, if you've seen anything about Endfield, then you've probably seen some images and trailers where there's a certain someone in that game who looks mighty similar. Well, how is that? Well, that's because she has a special immortality called the Gemini cycle. Which means when she dies, she's reborn in a new body, hatched from a cocoon created by the symbiotic construct, which are referred to as monsters, which are semi-autonomous beings of their own. She looks like a feline now because she modified her body to look like one to fit in with the Terrans, but what she ever looked like before that, maybe it was just a normal human? I don't know. Interestingly though, as well, is that she is not immune to Originium, despite being a creation of Predecessors. And that is the people that inhabit Terra and the people whom will one day travel to Talos too. So now, let us look at some of the major events that occurred on Terra that you can consider to be a lead up to Endfield, because it's not just the people and the characters and the, Originium magic and things like that that are shared between these two games. Despite the time differences, there are specific events that are what allowed Terra, or allowed Talos and Endfield to even exist in the first place. These events started what I like to call the Age of Exploration for Terra. So let's take a look at the news. Starting off, we have an event in 1099. Chief Director of Rhine Lab, Christian Wright, successfully launched the Horizon Arc project into space. This was the first successful and real attempt at Terran space flight. The Aegir attempted 300 years prior, but that project had to be put on hold indefinitely due to ongoing events under the ocean. We'll talk a bit about that in a bit. The Galleria Stellaria pierced through the star pod using a high-energy laser beam. And this tore a hole in the star pod, revealing the true night sky to the world for the first time ever. This fueled a renewed interest in astronomy and other space sciences, and of course proved that space travel was possible. We might see more Rhine Lab space stuff, both in Arknights and potentially in Endfield. But that was the start. That was the start, the first catalyst for the Age of Exploration. Then, in 1100, the Aegir broadcast a message across Terra asking the terrestrial nations to unite with them against the seaborne threat, and offering their advanced technology to help advance Terran civilization. You see, the Aegir are the most advanced civilization on Terra. They live underwater, actually. Their technology is Originium free, and that's because it all stems from Predecessor technology, which is how they were able to get spaceflight 300 years before Rhine Lab. Part of this broadcast included geographical data on the most enigmatic regions of Terra, such as the Foan Hotlands and the Infi ice fields, and also areas that Terrans did not know even existed. And this fueled a new age of exploration, both on the continent and beyond. And then the last major event, at least that we know about at this point in time. Arknights is still an ongoing game, so who knows, but we have at some point in the future, probably in the early 1100s as well, I would imagine, from my calculations. We have Magellan, a researcher for Rhine Lab, who goes on an expedition through Sami to find her lost boss, Director Mariam. Mariam had gone on an expedition into the Infi ice fields, but his team never returned. That's just the catalyst for why Magellan goes there, but it's not what's important about that. Because this is the age of exploration. The first expedition by Magellan, she came back with a mysterious flower that was revealed to be a source of collapsal corruption. What are the collapsals? The collapsals are extra-dimensional aliens that have managed to break their way into our reality through the Infi ice fields and the Foen hotlands, but that's not important right now. The nations in the north of the world have known about collapsals pretty much forever because they've had to fight them off. But the general public and the wider world does not know about them. Magellan returning with a collapsal flower revealed the collapsal's existence to the wider world and also became the catalyst for further exploration into the ice fields. What else could there be there? And so Magellan launched a second expedition to find any other strange discovery and also her lost boss, but sorry, Mariam, you're not important right now. And that second expedition culminates in the discovery of the Ether Gate, perhaps the single greatest discovery in the history of Terra. A megastructure created by the Predecessors, a portal which the collapsals were using to break into our reality. After its discovery, all the major nations of Terra would send scientists to research this megastructure, and a multinational collaborative project called the Black Hole Protocol was created with Rhodes Island as the overseers. The ultimate goal of the protocol was to repair the Ether Gate, which they do. And that is what opens the way for Terrans to travel to Talos 2. Not by spaceflight, but through portals, wormholes. Spaceflight's possible, but it took a massive amount of energy to break through the star pod, and the star pod heals itself. So it wasn't as viable. That is why the Ether Gate is such an important discovery. And that now leads us to Endfield. And I have a few theories I'd like to discuss. Utilizing the lore that we know from Arknights and how it relates to Endfield. First, number one, is what I call the assimilated clone theory. We know that Originium stores information by assimilating matter. That information is pulled into an internal dimension called the assimilated universe. And we know for several reasons, including the very nature of life and civilization on Terra, that information can be pulled out of Originium. Which is why I posit the assimilated clone theory. If Endfield takes place in the future, the characters that we recognize from Arknights are not the same person, but rather clones created from the information of that person inside Originium. The mechanics are there to allow this to happen, and the characters whom this could apply to all have, from what I've seen, rhombus pupils, which is important because the rhombus is the symbol of Originium. We also know about the player character, the Endman, whom is likely, highly likely, pretty much guaranteed to be a predecessor. Potentially even the Doctor. And that's interesting because they're a combat character. But as we know now, the predecessors, Homo sapiens, real humans, are weaker than Terrans. So how could they contend in combat? It's not impossible, I suppose, but a likely solution is that if their body is made from information within Originium, well, their body can be as strong as they want. This is further supported by the fact that the Endmen can swap their gender whenever they want. And they do that through Originium. I rest my case. So, for the people of Endfield to have this control over Originium, right? They have to have the control of Originium to be able to do this cloning, to pull information out of it. They have to have control over it. Which means that Originium has to have been made safe. And it's because Endfield still uses Originium as fuel. They brought Originium with them. At first, when I saw this, I was like, why did you do this? Why? Why would you do this? You have, presumably, Aegir technology now. The Aegir were offering technology. Why would you need to continue to use Originium? But if Originium has been made safe, then presumably it's not a problem. They're not actually going to be polluting Talos. They aren't going to be getting Oripathy anymore, question mark? Because they have control over Originium. I did have the thought that maybe they only have partial control, that they've made a partition, perhaps, over some region of Originium's assimilated universe that lets them control that. It's a possibility. The safetiness of Originium, I would feel like if they have control over it, and I do believe that they have control over it, this theory, assimilated clone theory, I am guaranteeing you is correct. To me, that would mean they have to have control over it. But I can't guarantee that that is true. We'll see what the devs explain that as. The other theory is actually a newer theory of mine. I actually created pretty much as I was making this presentation. And that is for the Agoloi. The Agoloi are a bit of a conundrum to me. So, according to what's been said, the Agoloi were on Talos 2 when the Terrans arrived. However, if you look at them, what do you notice? Two things. Number one, they seem to be made out of minerals. Number two, they have halos. And also, their name literally means angel. Well, we know about halos and angels. Like I mentioned before, in 1101, the law attempted to convert all things on Terra into angels. And by doing so, was giving things halos. Just as the Sankta, which was its first conversion, have. In this case, angel was describing a state of information being that could exist inside Originium. A character, Anduin, was shown a vision of Originium fragments with halos. I'm looking at you, Agoloi, which look like Originium creatures with halos. Could the Agoloi be another attempt at creating angels? It's a bit of a conundrum, because as I said, apparently the Agoloi were already on Talos when the Terrans arrived. So it'd have to be an attempt prior to Originium's usage on Terra. If it was not, if that was not the case, if the Agoloi were not said to have been there already, then I would be like, for sure, this is a scheme by Originium, but their origin has a bit of a wrench because of that. But their appearance really does point to, I think, there has to be a connection. There has to be. And if there isn't, that's insane that the devs would make them look like this. Time will tell. But that is the presentation. Thank you all for coming. I should caveat that this is all presented from my knowledge, sourced from, of course, events in the game. In February, soon enough, a lore book, Terra: A Journey, will be released in English. It's already been out for years in Chinese. But I have not read any sort of translation of it. that lore book could change some things, could add a bunch of extra details. And I'm sure it will, actually. So this is all made before that is available to me as an individual. But that does not mean in any way that the information I'm presenting here was inaccurate. I will be doing a stream of reading that book when it's released. So if you really want to deep dive into the juicy details, the real juicy details, be sure to tune in then. But that is all the lore I think that you need as someone going into playing Arknights Endfield without much knowledge about Arknights. Where the people came from, who the people are, and what are some of the situations that brought us to Endfield. There is, of course, a much more lore and story out there. But none of that is as important as it relates Endfield, at least in my opinion. So all that said, and thank you all for watching. And may the sands of time treat you well.